Um, yeah, so good afternoon. Good afternoon from London. Thankfully, it's not raining right now. I just got in yesterday, and Naomi, who is one of the associates at the Firma Advisory, like she mentioned, will be moderating this panel. So so much is going on in the energy space in Nigeria and across the world. And we all know that there's a global energy transition. The reason why this is very, very important is because, Nigeria as a country has derived most of its revenues from the oil and gas sector. So, in the 70s, we discovered crude. Now they've declared a decade of gas because we know that, gas, we have more gas in Nigeria than oil. The thing about oil as well, oil and gas, nations have become rich from that. Nations have been able to develop infrastructure and increase the quality of life of citizens. However, in Nigeria, it's a mixed story. On one hand, yes, we have had some level of development. We've had some of the biggest IOCs, exploring mining oil in Nigeria. We've had the Chevrons, the Mobiles, Totals, and all of the above. And then now, we're in a state where most companies, most countries are transitioning. There's the Paris Agreement that was signed by President Buhari, and everyone now is trying to decarbonize, is trying to move to net zero, and a lot of renewable energy sources have been developed, like solar, wind, amongst others, nitrogen, all that stuff. So where do we stand as a nation at the moment? That's the purpose of this webinar. One, how can we leverage the recent trends, the recent technology, the recent advancements as a nation so that we don't miss out on this race, this current transition that is going on? How can people take advantage of some of these opportunities that have come up? How can people that are lawyers like myself and Naomi and Albert on this call, or engineers like Otome, like Somkele, who is Somkele is the jack of all trade. Oh. Yeah, yeah. So the point is, how do all of us, what role can we all play? What can we do as young people, most especially? Because the energy sector has also enriched people as well. So what can we do as young people to add value, to take up opportunities, to have investments? And so that's why we've called on experts. All the people on this call know their stuff. They work on this stuff day to day, right? So we're really looking forward to learning from them. For instance, Somkele is with the Energy Transition Office in Nigeria. What is Nigeria doing right now? For those who don't know, well, we're looking forward to learning from him. Otome is currently in Canada, but he does a lot of work in the space in Nigeria, in Africa as a whole. Tengi also does a lot of work in the space as well. So we're looking forward to hearing from each and every one of them on how we can, move the sector forward, how we can add value. So thank you all for joining. I'm sure people will keep joining during the course of the webinar. And yes, thank you so much. So back to you, Naomi, and looking forward to a great conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ms. Chine. And rightfully said, as an energy law firm, we have to be on top of things, and we have to, engage in this kind of dialogue and conversation. And particularly, this webinar is centered around Africa's decarbonization efforts. We know that there have been a lot of hydrocarbon discoveries across Africa. For instance, Eni, which is an Italian oil and gas company, headquartered in Rome, just found, oil and gas in offshore Ivory Coast. So how do you balance these hydrocarbon resources and discoveries alongside decarbonization efforts? That's really where what the problem is, what the situation is like. How do we do that? How do we manage the resources, revenue we're getting from hydrocarbon discoveries, and use that to finance decarbonization efforts, renewable energy, green energy? So yeah, all of those things. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers. I'm so eager to meet them. I know a lot of you are as well. So we're just going to go quickly to the introductions. Like Ms. Chineye has said, they are experts in the energy landscape, and I'm really excited to hear from them and just like learn from them and the knowledge that they're going to pour into us. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Tengi George Okoli, who is a senior officer at Natural Resource Governance Institute. I'm sure she's on this call. Hi, Tengi. Pleasure to meet you.
Hi, good morning. Happy to be here. Only that it's Ikoli, not Okoli. Happens all the time, never mind.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'd just like you to just introduce yourself, tell us a bit about what you do. Yeah, let's just get to know you.
Okay, thanks for having me on the call. As said, my name is Tengi George Ikoli. I'm a senior officer with the Natural Resource Governance Institute. I'm also a member of the Publish What You Pay Global Council. At NRGI, we do a lot of work around oil, gas, and mining governance. Our work goes beyond Nigeria, so we have a lot of expertise in on the continent. So Ghana, Senegal, Uganda, DRC, and then beyond we have work in MENA regions, Latin America. So we have a lot of lessons that we're able to draw from in terms of how countries are navigating the energy transition, from new producers like Senegal, where they try, and Ghana as well, a bit more advanced, but not quite as advanced in Nigeria, always taking lessons on what not to do from Nigeria. And then we have expertise from other regions that are navigating renewables a lot more to Latin America. And then having conversations about on the continent, how to navigate using gas as a transition fuel, what that means in the immediate term and what has to be done, and then what should be done in terms of right sizing Nigeria's or other countries' ambitions, given the challenges that currently exist on the globe with attracting finance, and then the infrastructure deficits also that exist. And then we look at methane emissions reduction as well, because if you're actually expanding your use of gas and fossil fuels or leveraging that in the meantime, given fossil fuel dependencies, it's important to make sure that that's juxtaposed with methane emission reduction strategies, which speaks to the conversation that we'll be having around decarbonization. And then finally, you also need to make sure that those who are affected, so the people on the ground, the grassroots, people that suffer a lot of these impacts in terms of their lives, inhaling, using these sort of pollutions around them as well, air, environment, etc., that you're managing the exposure to them as well, mindful of what has been caused, what they have suffered through exploitation of fossil fuels, and making sure that that is front of mind and that is reflected in regulation and laws as well to ensure that the impacts are minimized. So very exciting work that we do. I'm excited to share it on this platform as well. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the work that you do at Natural Resource Governance Institute. So next we have Somkere Awakalu, who is a finance specialist at Sustainable Energy for All and also a member of the Energy Transition Office. Hi, nice to meet you, Somkere. So you could just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you.
Thank you very much. It's a hard act to follow Tengi with that elaborate explanation of what she does, but I'll try and make sure I'm kind of in the same ballpark. So my name is Somkele Awakalu. I'm calling from Nigeria, so if the internet is a bit techy, don't blame it on me. So I'm a finance specialist at the Energy Transition Office. But that Energy Transition Office is staffed and supported by Sustainable Energy for All. And what we actually do is we're an implemented secretariat for the Energy Transition Plan. So maybe later on in the conversation, I'll explain what the plan encompasses that for Nigeria to reach net zero emissions by 2060. So a lot of what we try to do is we try to follow the transition thesis across those pathways, enable access to financing for projects and project sponsors, also connecting financiers to renew their, so that I can have more to say later on the webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So last but certainly not the least, we have Peter Otome, who is the Managing Director, African Operations at Modern West. Peter, could you just, let's get to know you. Hi, good morning.
How are you? I hope you don't mind my green background. I'm trying to illustrate clean energy.
Green, I love
I don't know
that.
why people pick the green color. I don't know if it's green or blue, but it's nice to be here, and thanks for inviting me. It's about 5 a.m. where I am, currently in the US for a conference, but I had to show up because of the importance of this topic. I work for a sustainability advisory firm, and I think a lot of what we do is tied to what the other esteemed panelists have spoken to. So carbon markets, for example, which is a global phenomenon. It's growing. It's worth billions of dollars as we speak. And this sort of incentivizes companies, organizations to develop greenhouse gas emission reduction initiatives. Nigeria has taken a bold step to set up in a carbon market, which is very noble and would be a disruptor, a game changer. So we'll see how that, and I'd love to hear more about the experience within the room around the activation process. So we do trade for companies, support companies through project development. We do, of course, your baselining for greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, 3. And of course, tell the story, because speaking to sustainability programs, helping companies come up to speed with ESG framework, and basically come up with a bespoke solution, because it's not one size fits all. Everybody has their own journey, and you don't want to slow the business down because you're trying to be, you want to come up to speed with what's happening globally. You do what you need to do to be fit for the future. And then we do a bit of research and innovation. So we work across the continent. Of course, business started here in North America, but has spread into Africa, and really keen on collaborations. I think in terms of our resource base, we've heard the numbers so many times. A lot of reserves in gas, over 200 TCF of reserves, which is proven volumes, almost 40 to 45 billion barrels of oil. This is in Nigeria alone. Other parts of Africa have significant volumes. However, there's this clamor for energy transition. We have to fulfill our energy needs first. It's a balancing act. How do we balance these two issues? Because we contribute just 3% to the 3 to 4% to climate emissions, but we face the effects. You see the flooding, seen lots of videos from different parts of Nigeria. These are after effects of climate change. It's real. It's not just something that we read in textbooks. We are facing the impacts. So what can we do to balance this situation we're in, ensure we meet our energy needs, and also do that in a sustainable fashion? We're also blessed with renewable energy sources, so there's really potential to blend this mix in a way that we achieve all the objectives. So let me stop there and hand back to you. And I'm sure the conversations would take shape as we go ahead. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. So I'm really glad that you just expanded a bit on the need to balance these two things that are occurring, our drive towards decarbonization and also harnessing the resources that we get from hydrocarbon discoveries or resources. And now I just want us to speak a bit on and I want Tengi to speak on this actually, how we can balance recent hydrocarbon discoveries with decarbonization efforts, taking a look at it from the regulatory standpoint and policy standpoint. So Tengi, I just want you to speak a bit on that. Tengi, I don't know if you're still.
Sorry, yes. No, I'm here. It's technical glitches. Yes. Your question again, please?
So I was just saying that, it's the major discussion is how to balance, hydrocarbon resources and decarbonization efforts, Africa's decarbonization efforts, and I just want you to look at it from from a regulatory and policy standpoint. So how can recent hydrocarbon discoveries be balanced with Africa's decarbonization efforts, taking a look at the regulatory aspects and policy implementation and all of that?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's I think a very important question and something that some countries where NIGI works have actually been dabbling with this question. The starting point, unfortunately or fortunately, is always from what Nigeria has done and what others can learn from that process. With the new discoveries in Senegal, there has been a very deliberate sort of effort to make sure that they consider what approaches that they can take in terms of this new exploration around gas, right? One of the steps that they had taken was around trying to get financing first. And I wouldn't want to sort of encroach on what some Kide might be speaking about later on, but it's around just transition partnerships. So how they can get financing for their efforts around decarbonization while still exploring options to increase their gas usage, gas exploration, etc. One of the things that they've done, again, as I said, is around getting concessions around making sure that they have very strong beneficiation systems to ensure the rights and benefits of those revenues that are coming from fossil fuels will be properly spent, first of all, and can also feed into their transition plans and their development plans. Another thing they try to do as well is try to have a very strong financial fiscal framework to guide the revenues that are coming from the space. And Uganda has done something similar in ensuring that the revenues are shared not just at the federal, but also going to the different communities. So there's a say that communities have in terms of the way the revenues are shared. And then in Ghana, they've adopted a strong mechanisms to reduce emissions as well. Senegal has also done the same thing. They've created a roadmap around methane emission reduction, so that as they are increasing their gas exploration, they're also putting in place regulations, guidelines that limit the emissions from the different petroleum production processes that they have. There has been a concerted effort as well to increase and adopt transparency mechanisms. So ways to increase disclosures of contracts, models to make sure that the citizens are aware of the ways in which their governments are making deals on their behalf. Again, to avoid challenges that Nigeria has had in terms of corruption. So they've put in place these sorts of policies within their laws as well. So yeah, those are some Uganda, and in Ghana. One of the other efforts that has been taken by Senegal is to also look into a sovereign wealth fund, which is sort of a program or platform that allows them to save monies directly from fossil fuels that they can use again to ensure for development within their country. Obviously, something that Nigeria has not been as good at in the past in terms of saving the revenues from fossil fuels. And this is a lesson as well that Senegal has learned and are trying to minimize that risk as well. So those are some of the examples in terms of what other countries are doing. Ghana, has taken a lot of almost a one-to-one approach in terms of what Nigeria has put in place with its Petroleum Industry Act. A lot of the consultants and support that actually went into creating Nigeria's initial governance framework also provided support to the Ghanaian government. So things around creating a very strong institutional framework and oversight to ensure that the governance of these resources are strengthened. But there have been challenges in that as well, where the government may have assigned revenues from fossil fuels for projects that were not necessarily supportive of the energy transition. So again, into investing into more gas projects, etc. There was a scenario where civil society organizations actually pushed back in terms of how the government was spending its money. So money from Sovereign Wealth Fund, for instance, instead of spending it on projects that were fully focused on gas for the future, they wanted them to spend more money on renewable projects. So the revenue plans around that as well have supported more of a balancing act. So instead of going fully into fossil fuels, they've also encouraged their government to focus on renewable projects where fossil fuel projects were not the only option for them to take. So these countries are juxtaposing their long-term decarbonization efforts by looking at their oil and gas projects, but also looking at if instead of looking at oil and gas projects, are there other alternatives that they can look at? So into renewables, for instance, are there other investments that they could make? And are there strong fiscal regimes that they can put in place to ensure that communities benefit from the revenues from fossil fuels, and then also that the funds are spent in the right way and that they're saved for both their development and for their just energy transition. So I'll pause there.
All right, thank you so much. And I like what you said about how you can use the revenues you're getting from fossil fuels and channel them into renewable energy projects and stuff like that. And this is where Somkele comes in, and I would really like him to speak on how Africa can strategically balance the financial benefits of hydrocarbon exploration with their environmental commitments and transition to renewable energy. So I'd just like you to briefly talk about that, because I think it's important that we consider the financial aspects of these things as well.
Thank you very much. So apologies, I was going in and out when Tengi was talking. I already apologized for the tech earlier on. So it's a great question about how we balance sort of explorations and revenues that we get from hydrocarbons and how we're also trying to transition to renewable energy. So the whole point of an energy transition is not an energy leap. It's an energy transition means that there is going to be some consideration given to your existing economic profile. So right now, if they're finding new hydrocarbon frontiers in Namibia, in Senegal, as Tengi has spoken about, in South Africa, that sort of makes sense. But if you're going to spend XYZ money to explore, there's an opportunity to cost to that in terms of adoption of renewable energy. So I just want to walk back a bit and for a lot of people, when they consider a renewable energy investments, it almost seems like they're considering it from a point of view of this is something that is not viable and we need to just do it because we want to save the planet or we want to prevent catastrophe. But the actual fact of the matter is that if you put side-by-side comparisons in certain investment areas, renewable energy is actually the more viable option in the long term. So in terms of balancing that act, I feel like when government stakeholders or private sector investors look at their books and they look at financial projections. So if, for instance, you're looking at total cost of ownership of ICE vehicles versus electric vehicles, there are studies out there that show that it's actually more viable for you to go for the electric vehicles, not just on the capex side of things, because people always look at how much you have to pay up front to adopt renewable energy. But when you look across the total life cycle of whatever technology that you're looking at, it's actually more viable for you to go with the renewable energy option. So it's a good thing that Tengi touched on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which is a financing arrangement where G7 countries support emerging economies with their transition with a focus on socioeconomic consequences. So when you're transitioning from, for instance, in a country like Nigeria, where there's a huge focus on oil and gas, and we get a lot of revenues from there, in order for you to transition to solar, to wind, to hydro, there's going to be a need to upskill, because if you're no longer going in the hydrocarbon side, there are consequences for the amount of staff that are skilled there, the workforce, the host communities and whatnot. So balancing that is understanding that there has to be a long-term strategy to transition, and which is why the energy transition plan comes into it. And just for those who don't know, the energy transition plan is a federal executive council approved document that charts a decarbonization pathway across 5 key verticals all the way to 2060. Those 5 key verticals are responsible for 65% of Nigeria's carbon emissions. And I'll list them out. The first one is power. And the thesis there, the transition thesis there, is really around diesel and petrol genset displacements. So I'll come back to each of them. On the transport side, is really moving from ICE vehicles, so internal combustion engines, to more electric vehicles. In Nigeria, I know there's a lot of policy direction around CNG and whatnot. That's also fine, but in the long term, it's a transition to electric vehicles. On the building side, is really we're thinking around solarization of government buildings. If you know Sterling Bank headquarters, they have solarized their entire building. So they're really working on off-grid technologies to power their headquarters. And it's also around clean cooking. Chineye had, in her introduction, spoken about, I think it's Chineye or Tengi, has spoken about some respiratory problems from inhalation of smoke. So it's really about moving from those solid fuels to cleaner cooking technologies. And then there's industry, which is around the heating that is used in cement manufacturing and the likes of heavy industry, as well as oil and gas, which is around reducing emissions, flare emissions. So there's a lot of flaring that goes on. And in order to decarbonize that sector, you have to significantly reduce flaring. The reason why I'm providing that background is because in each of those verticals, there are economic opportunities for the country. It's not a situation where we're asking people to transition, but there is no economic benefits to that. There are benefits to that. In fact, if you look at what's going on in international trade, there's a massive international trade war going on between China and America because of electric vehicles, the adoption of electric vehicles. So they're making a whole slew of money there in China by exporting their electric vehicles, and America is saying, wait, hold on, we need to have a piece of that action. So in balancing the act, we need to understand that as a country in Nigeria, we're not in autarky, we're in a globalized economy. So if people are taking policy directions in the global north or in developed economies, that is going to have an impact, and there's a lag time. So in certain developed economies, for instance, they have enacted policies where at a certain point in time, they're going to phase out the use of ICE vehicles. So if we on this side, despite not contributing a large amount of emissions to global emissions, we're still going to be left in a case where we can't even get spare parts for our ICE vehicles. So in balancing, it means understanding that there's a need for a just transition, but also being able to understand that there's also a potential revenue generation stream. Even if you think about it from a capital importation perspective, so foreign direct investment, there's about $1.3 trillion worth of climate finance out there. And that climate finance is looking for projects. So the actual fact of the matter is that we have less projects than the available financing for renewable energy. That's actually a fact. So I believe that for Nigeria, and it's showing in the policy direction that the government is taking, because recently they appointed a special presidential envoy on climate action. There are two key presidential committees on climate. One is on climate action and green economic solutions, and one of them is a project Evergreen City, which is a green industrialization city, sort of like a special green economic zone where your cost can, if you're a renewable energy manufacturer, your cost can significantly go down, and so it all comes down to dollars and cents. But I feel like definitely Nigeria must be given time, and the African continent must be given time to justly transition. But I think that what we need to really emphasize is that there is a lot of returns on investment that can come in terms of the renewable energy side. So I'll just stop there. Hopefully that clarified my position on your question.
Yes, it did, absolutely. And I would maybe much later on in the conversation, I'd really like you to speak a bit more on the ETP and what you would say the short-term and long-term goals are for the ETP. I think that will give us an idea of the kind of perspective, will give us a little bit of a perspective on where we're headed. You know, I think that will come back to that. So for Otome, I would just like you to speak. I know that you are a project expert, and I know that you do a lot of projects for international oil and gas, companies, and project management for international oil and gas companies. So I would just like you to talk about what factors can be, considered when assessing the scalability and feasibility of decarbonization projects for implementation in Africa, and I'm sure in Nigeria as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just before I respond to that question, I would also want to speak a bit to the last comment Tengi made. Sorry, Sumkele. So, when I hear energy transition, I like what he said when he said just energy transition, right? You have to have something to transition from, right? You can't transition from nothing. So first and foremost, we have to ensure we have the energy, and there's a gap. So that gap has to be filled, with what we have. And what we have in abundance are the oil and gas resources we have. However, the mindset has to change. There has to be more investment in technology to make it cleaner, right? So that's sort of the angle I wanted to highlight, because if you think about it, if you look at the life cycle of renewable energy projects, solar energy, for example, a lot of the input or the ingredients, or the raw materials that are required come from oil and gas. You know, the batteries that we use in EVs, where do you think, some of the components come from? It's oil and gas. We talk about bioplastics, that come from ethanol. That is from oil and gas. Carbon fibers, oil and gas. So there has to be a balancing act and a reality check. And each country, each jurisdiction has to come up with a plan. And hence, um, freaking Nigeria didn't jump on the bandwagon of 2050. It was 2060 that was adopted. So that shows that there's some thought process, behind that. So coming back to your question, I think when you talk about key factors, I think things to consider are the economics of the country. So economic viability is extremely key. You also want to look at the regulatory environment as well. You want to look at, local resource availability. So, for example, in Africa, um, it's clear we have adequate, vast solar and wind potential, right? And that's why, if you talk about the Sahara Desert, it has the highest solar potential or insolation in the world. If you talk about economic ability, these projects, like it was said earlier on, are becoming more capex friendly. There's been a lot of optimization. And when you talk about for solar energy projects, for example, the photovoltaic costs have dropped significantly by 60 to 70% in the past decade because there's a lot of innovation and research going into that space. You speak to um, technical feasibility, and that really revolves around infrastructure, right? There has to be local infrastructure to support these new technologies. So in Nigeria, for example, like we know different sources of power generation, there's gas to power, there's hydro, and now there's renewable. How can we safely and seamlessly tie renewable energy sources into the grid, right? Because of the massive potential we have. That is something that borders around infrastructure. That's something that is being actively looked into as we speak. I mentioned regulatory environment, which is key. You have a lot of countries across Africa adopting regulations that make these investments in renewable energies friendlier, right? So the right regulations are critical. And then, of course, mindset change, right? We have oil and gas. Like I mentioned, transition is not about dropping that natural resource we have in abundance. It's about increasing the mix of other forms of energy, in this instance, renewable, coming into the mix. And so we have to have that acceptance by, by the populace. It's very critical. And very easy ways to do that is, which is what we're seeing in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, is adoption in local communities, rural areas of renewable energy projects. So there's a need for that community engagement, going to the grassroots. We see a lot of that happening in Kenya, of solar-based projects. Nigeria has a renewable energy master plan as well. And basically this is supposed to frame, or is helping to frame out, adoption of renewable energy in the country. There's the Solar Nigeria project, which is also helping to support solar power solutions in Nigeria. So the list it goes on and on. These are different strategies that are required and have been adopted by different countries across Africa. And these factors need to tie well together, right? So that these decarbonization projects adopted. But I will still keep saying this, oil and gas is not going away. It is required to transition, in fact, and that's why government has come up with things like the decade of gas, which is really around developing gas-related projects, supporting clean cooking, and that really, demonstrates the reality check that has come into this space of energy transition. So I'll stop there and give room to others to speak.
Thank you so much, Otome. I don't know if anyone wants to, say something on that, Tengi, or Somkele wants to just make some contributions to that as well. Somkele, I don't know if you want to say anything, or Tengi.
Yeah. Tengi, maybe ladies first, if Tengi has something.
Okay. Thank you, Somkele. I just wanted to, I guess, frame my initial submission and tie into what has just been said. Yeah, it's a rhetoric or a belief that Nigeria has more gas than it does its oil. And that's been the case for a very long time. But there are questions as to, if that's been the case, why is it not been exploited to the extent where we all have access to energy? There are challenges with investments into gas. There have been ambitions to create a strong gas framework for years, but unfortunately, the PIA came in rather late in the day in 2021, where you didn't have the fiscal setup that allowed the downstream and midstream to thrive. And in that, it's now come at a situation where, yes, we have deposits of gas, but where are the funds going to come in to unlock and invest in non-associated gas, right? We have about a 1-to-1 almost pairing for what we have for associated gas versus non-associated gas. How do we disassociate our gas from oil production? Essentially, there are challenges there in terms of infrastructure, how to connect it to markets as well. So there are challenges there. Nigeria has had really ambitious plans for gas for years, but it has not been able to bring it to life. Now, bringing it back to energy transition, you now have a context where the world is looking to decarbonize. It's looking to invest more in renewable energies. So where's the funding that's required for that going to come from? Which is why countries like Ghana, Senegal, etc., who have tried to leverage gas as a transition fuel, are recognizing that it may not be the pathway to try to address all their domestic energy needs, because there's more funding for renewables, essentially. There's more interest in renewables, but there is still the capacity for them to also invest in it for themselves. But this is why you have to have this holistic framework. Nigeria has its energy transition plan. How detailed that framework is and how that connects to how we can transition specifically from fossil fuels to gas, to oil to gas to renewables, and what that mix will be at the end of the day may not be as clear. Ghana has its own framework as well, but it tries to address the institutional gaps, ensuring that there's coordination across, because we need a strong coordination for those that are managing gas and oil resources and managing renewable projects as well, to see what the flow is, what the mix is, what the trade-offs are, where we will use gas or renewables, for instance. Will we use it for clean cooking? Will we use it for industry? Will we use it for transportation? Is it the petroleum routes or the CNG routes or electric cars? Question mark, question mark. Nigeria has light issues already. I think my light has gone out while I'm having this conversation, so what would that look like? So it's important to have that longer framework to make sure that we know where oil fits in, where gas fits in, where renewables fits in, what are the timelines around this, what are the yearly plans, what is the funding that's going to go into these sorts of processes, who is going to coordinate these efforts. We have NCCC, we have Energy Transition Office, As their coordination as well with the Ministry of Petroleum Resources, the Decade of Gas, yes, but is that a 2030 to reduce gas flaring plan, as is within the NDC and ETP, or is that a forever plan? What does that look like? What are the timelines, and how do they all fit in? How do they marry each other? That's how we can have that sort of framework that then says institutionally, who is coordinating these efforts, who is implementing what are their mandates, where does the line end for all of them? Governance, how we're making sure that there's a transparent process, that everybody is working kind of, you can say, what Ministry of Petroleum Resources is doing, NUPRC is doing, etc. The Decade of Gas plan actually was only, website anyway, was only published a few weeks ago. And Decade of Gas started in 2021, we're in and supposed to end 2030. Now that we have that, where are the actual timelines? What does that look like? How are we managing that? What are the finances? What's the fiscal framework that's supposed to support that effort? These are lessons that other countries are trying to learn from Nigeria, but again, we're not as clear, but it's important for us to still drive this process. What are also the environmental frameworks as well? Because all of these different plans are great, are laudable for trying to resolve domestic energy needs, etc. But how will they also make sure that we preserve the lives of those who are in those sort of communities? We're all aware that in Port Harcourt for years there was soot pollution. How are those things sort of resolved? How is that factored in? Because believe it's not a separate issue. It's all part of the same sort of thinking. You cannot leave one part and talk about the institutional, the financing, etc., and then not leave how it's actually impacting people on the ground. So this framework that we need, roadmaps, plans that other countries are adopting from Nigeria, you also need to look at the legal framework. How does that provide governance, institutional framework, transparency, and then looking at the institutional framework, how are those strengthened? Look at the environmental frameworks. What guides all of these things? That's what the legal framework does. But also, how do you include the voices of people who live in these communities, who have a direct impact, as opposed to having it somewhere above, where we're all just talking about these things and implementing without knowing that the woman I had an interesting conversation once with my last comment. I'm not talking too long. With some people in communities where they were saying, jollof rice, for instance, is very sweet when you use like charcoal, but then you're saying that you need to use clean cooking. They're like, would that one be as sweet? So how do you teach that sort of person? You're saying at the other level, we're shifting to clean cooking, but then the person that's meant to use this has a different mindset. So it speaks to the point that was made earlier, that we also have to be cognizant of shifting mindsets, shifting narratives, and showing the benefits of what the transition should look like. We're creating these legal frameworks for who? So we have to create them with people's sort of thoughts and lifestyles in mind. I'll pause there. Thank you.
I really, really want to jump in. I don't know if it's okay if I just jump in before some of the other speakers continue. Tengi, I don't know how to explain it, but you literally just read my mind. You literally just said a lot of things that have been a source of worry to me. It just your last point on jollof rice. I personally like smoky jollof rice. In fact, there's a place that has me on a chokehold right now where I drive to get smoky jollof rice, every day when I go to work. And these things have almost become part of our culture, But then again, on a more serious note, right? This whole decade of gas thing at the Firma advisory, we do a lot around energy advisory, and we work with clients, and it's actually been challenging trying to track, now that the decade of that's supposed to be 10 years, right? In fact, at some point I heard a minister say that in fact it's no longer decade of gas is now the destination. So we're not even we're not transitioning again, it's the destination. So different parts of governments have their different timelines, milestones, and the coordination. It's so challenging to know, are we at this point yet? I mean, I was recently in Canada, and Otome knows this. We toured all the sites, different, energy sites, seeing what Canada is doing as a country. Canada has a similar energy sector to Nigeria. And when they talked about methane emissions, they said they want to reduce their methane emissions by 40%. This is the policy of government. And, they said that they met the targets even before the timeline they gave themselves by 20, and I was in shock. The way government, private sector stakeholders, they make a plan, everybody follows the plan, they know their milestones, they are tracking, they have data to say, okay, we're at this point now, we have to increase this, everybody's carried along. And I was just like, wow, this is a system that works. Nigeria, I think it was a Total MD or somebody recently that said that Nigeria is in a permanent state of debate, right? We've been debating the same issues for decades. Most people that are divesting out of the assets in Nigeria are not doing it because, Nigeria has sweet crude. We have so many things to advantage. We have all the natural resources, but guess what? This governance framework, this lack of coherence of our policies, coordination, certainty, clarity is not good for business. It's not good for investment, and people cannot plan long term. Look, I'm not trying to bash or anything, because obviously I want the system to work. I'm a proponent of the sector, right? And the whole idea of this energy webinar is to build, to make recommendations so that on the way forward. But if we're being very, very honest, right? And to be fair, we even tried to, apart from Sumkele, we had reached out to one or two people in the relevant NUPRC and all that. And you could even tell from their wariness to get on the call, is like, sorry to say, it's almost like they haven't really fine-tuned certain things yet. So they were almost afraid to make certain declarations or something, that kind of thing. So I get it. I get that, some of these, organizations are still being set up, the PIA has just come into force and all that, but we really need to have that certainty. We need to have that coordination. So you've made really great points, and I really don't want us to be just paying lip service, because I'm sorry to say, sometimes when you go for conferences and it's like the same, we talk about the same thing. You go today, is the same thing to next 10 years, So that's what I just wanted to touch on that point. And I really want us to take away some, moving forward, like, what would be good, like, likely next steps? What would be, from all of these perspective, right? Low-hanging fruits, although I don't really like to use that low-hanging fruits word because it's been bastardized in Nigeria. But what are the quick wins, or what we can do in the short term, medium term, and then what can we plan towards on the long term? So thank you for the comments. I've really been enjoying the conversation so far from all you speakers. So yeah, back to you guys. Thank you.
So just two quick comments. Sorry, Somkele, just two quick comments. One, you can actually get the smoky jollof rice taste if you use foil over your pots. Just to say, there are solutions that you can still have electric cooking. So that's actually something that I'm not against it. I'm just saying there are ways to achieve it, right? Okay. That's one. Two, I want to also say that our advocacy around the decade of gas has actually contributed to that website being published. So I would say now with the NUPRC has been responsive, so is our engagement with them that also had them publish the licensees that they awarded for the, what's that thing called again? The gas commercialization fair commercialization plan as well. So they are responsive. Again, the PIA has caused some delays and some changes in terms of the structures of the institutions. So I don't want to just sort of, say that they're not moving. We're moving, but we're moving a bit slower than, Ochechi's comment. Sorry, acknowledging my little tip. Yes, so I think there are ways that the government is actually moving and they're responsive. NUPRC, I would say, has been a very responsive partner and they're very engaged. So I want to make sure that is known. That obviously there are some partners in the government space that are willing to work with us and to acknowledge change. Not as fast as I would like, because 2024, creating the gas as well, there are things that we also want them, after having them disclose, we have things that we want them to also add to provide more detail. Does this fit into the long-range transition plan? If it doesn't, what are the plans? How do we explore that collaboration and coordination and cohesion around what the government is doing? So I think it's a very good platform for that. for clarifying that with ourselves and then now engaging with the government. So I'll stop there. Sorry, some kid. I didn't mean to speak this much. Please go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I do, without belaboring the jollof rice point, it may sound silly that is the way we are looking at things, but I know when we are doing purchasing power comparisons, we use the Big Mac index. So if we're speaking about clean cooking, it's okay for us to speak about jollof rice. Piggybacking on the foil method, there's actually something in ShopRite that you can buy that if you mix it in your jollof rice, it gives you that smoky taste. So that speaks to innovation. Now being on a serious perspective, one of the challenges or three challenges that we have with clean cooking is around affordability, acceptability, and adaptability. So if we're proffering solutions and we're saying we want to have solar cook stoves, for instance, instead of an electric pressure cookers, we need to make sure that there is a localized value chain for production of solar cook stoves. You also need to make sure that the workforce is upskilled so that in case your cook stove has a problem, you're able to quickly fix that. So as you're developing your transition thesis in clean cooking, you have to make sure that you have the renewable energy manufacturing in country or on the continent at least. In terms of advocacy, I think that Tengi is really right, and Chinenye, you're right as well. We have to do both approaches at the same time. We have to do a top-down approach and we have to do a bottom-up approach. So even when we are thinking about clean cooking, if I want to stay on that particular level, you have to understand the amount of people in a household in the north may not be the same amount of people in a household in the south. So if you're coming here and you're proffering a 2-burner solar cook stove solution to a region where there's predominantly 10 people per household, there's a mismatch of objectives. So coming from the bottom and understanding what some of the challenges are is extremely important. To go to your point, Chinenye, about plans, we're not lacking plans in Nigeria. What we are lacking is the implementation of some of those plans. There's no clarity around certain plans. And that's why one of the efforts that we made was to ensure that there is an alignment of sorts between the energy transition plan and nationally determined contributions. Because ultimately, your nationally determined contributions are really your commitment to the UNFCCC. And we're about to go into a new NDC preparation cycle to the NDC 3.0, which is due in 2025. And whatever commitments that we make there, whatever emissions targets that we have there, will be binding till the next iteration of the NDCs. So a lot of what we're doing now is to make sure that there's alignment and coordination, which is why I mentioned the Special Presidential Envoy on Climate Action earlier on. This is a position or an appointment that is created to basically coalesce the renewable energy ecosystem. And it doesn't stop at the 5 verticals of the ETP. It also includes AFOLU, so agriculture, forestry, and other land use, which is areas that are oft neglected. So I just wanted to put that out there, that there are definitely efforts that are being made to coordinate plans and to coordinate an overall strategy. Without taking much time, there was something that Ojome mentioned that I wanted to speak on. We're making a case about the abundance of oil and gas. There's an abundance of solar in Nigeria, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So when you're looking at, oh, we have XYZ trillions barrels of oil, XYZ trillions cups of gas, let's also know that there's XYZ radiation waste from solar, there's XYZ liters of hydro. I mean, the North-South Power recently signed a deal with NSIA, and they're pushing solar hydro hybrid plants at Shiroro. So there are a lot of efforts that are being made to understand the position that we are in and also get us to where we need to be. Happy also that Ojome acknowledged that Nigeria committed to net zero by 2060. In fact, India committed to net zero by 2070. So there are variances in that commitment. And just to finally clarify that net zero doesn't mean that there's not going to be any carbon emissions. It just means that the carbon emissions are going to be netted off. Yeah, Ghana also committed, by 2070. The emissions that are going out by 2060 should be netted off by whether it's carbon sequestration, whether it's carbon usage and capture, to ensure that there's a net zero. So it's fair enough to say, oh, oil and gas is going nowhere. But if we continue on that trend, we have to make sure that we're diversifying our energy mix. We have to make sure that we're paying attention to research and development in the renewable energy side. And Tengi also made a comment about that they've taken light in her house during this call. Fair enough, but actually where I'm at now, I don't know anything about taking light because I have a solar system on my roof that is able to carry the whole thing. So I don't even know when they are taking light or not. So we need to be able to adopt a lot of those technologies and we won't have those problems. Thank you. Over to you, Chineye.
Yes, so Nkele, thank you. Salient points, and I love your passion. I love your passion and your, So sorry, before you jump in there, I love, so some of these conversations we're having, to be very honest with you, are a little bit elitist. If I'm being very honest, like we're just talking easy, carbon sequestration, net zero by 2060, all of us understand. The little 1% of Nigeria or 2% or, whatever percent you might call it of these African countries. The average Nigerian has no idea what carbon sequestration, carbon credits, even maybe even say some of the elites. I'm not even talking about because when I say we're like 0.5% or something. I don't even have the data. That's just to show you how, the average Nigerian, when you're still dealing with issues like hunger, poverty, jobs. So, carrying the grassroots or the normal person along in this whole, value chain, opportunity cycle, and all that. I mean, as we're speaking to it, it just came to mind. Everything you said is great, and everything we're saying is great. It makes sense to us, but how do we? Because I believe that policies, right? The challenge we have with implementation is one: we have very weak institutions, right? We have capability traps in those institutions. So, I'm very happy. I saw you doing some trainings recently. All that stuff. Even 10 years, I saw some things you guys were doing. Fine, you guys are doing things on a certain level. And I'm sure even some people you're training are even elite. Now, there's a whole, huge vacuum of knowledge base, capability, it traps. And so how do we ensure that? Because the reason why these Western countries, right, are able to say, we're going to get to this by this is because they have the data to back it. They have the infrastructure to back it. They have the reports. So you're just saying that you have a dashboard that is showing you these are how many sites we have. This is how much CO2 is being, So it's just like, okay, all we just need to do. It's very practical for them, So I also want us to, figure out ways that we can get, And another thing on a separate note is this issue around investments, bringing FX into the system and having this energy sector be a medium for wealth creation. We've had, apart from the capability traps, another thing our institutions have is the issue of corruption, right? Corruption, rent-seeking, nepotism. So, for instance, if someone wants to get a license, for instance, that opacity is still back to like sometimes only the elite, is only the rich people, So how can we be more inclusive? How can we democratize energy? How can we, these are some of the things I know I'm throwing in questions. Naomi, I promise I'm not going to ask any more questions. But these are some of the things that when I think about this topic, they are top of mind, it hurts my feelings when I see, I was talking to somebody on the plane yesterday who is from Bayelsa State. She has worked in government on the state level, the federal level. Bayelsa State is one of the poorest countries or states in Nigeria. It's I think it should be the poorest. I think it's Bayelsa and another northern state. It's so shocking that states that produce the most energy are some of the poorest in terms of human capital development, in terms of, So the point is we're not inclusive. Our energy transition in the past, in the currently, is not inclusive. You know, you have jobless growth. So maybe our barrels of crude might be increasing, but it's not creating jobs. It's not creating, you know, it's not creating anything that the common man can say, okay, this has been a benefit to us, right? They don't even have the energy access, you know, not to talk of now being able to be stakeholders and, you know, stuff like that. So I know we've tried to do some things at the PIA for the host communities to do all this stuff, but the question is, will it be implemented? You know, thankfully, organizations like Tengi's organization and, you know, with AFPC and some of this, we try to do advocacy, policy, you know, but at the end of the day, it's still very high level, if you ask me. So what more can we do? You know, what more can we do? And even people on the call, how do we get all the people on the call to be champions too, to ensure, you know, but yeah, Sonkele, go ahead.
Otome, sorry, I know you wanted
okay.
to speak. So I just wanted to, just before I forget my train of thought, you look like you're smarter than me. So if I don't speak now, I'll forget what I want to say. Chineye, massive respect to you as always. You've raised a lot of good points. I just wanted to go with what Tengi said first about around affordability. Renewable energy is still in Nigeria, still is in its infancy. The reason for the high adoption cost is because we're importing everything that is related to that solar panel. But what has happened in recent times is that there is now a 100 megawatt facility for producing solar PV in Lagos. Oxano Solar is doing that. Naseni has done a groundbreaking on a solar cell manufacturing facility. And what that means is that eventually we're going to see the cost of that upfront solar system go down. And again, it's also about cutting our coats according to our sizes. So the panels that I have on my roof is not going to be the panels that certain other people have on their roofs. They may have 15, 20, 30 panels. There's a solar hybrid plant that we have in University of Abuja. There's about 3,000 panels there. You will be able to figure out that there are certain people in underserved areas, that's according to the grid, that only need a light bulb and a radio to be powered. And there are solar home systems for that. So there are solar home systems, there are solar systems for productive use. There's a whole wide range of solar solutions. So I get the point of the affordability, and that's why the Energy Transition Office is working with a lot of financiers to subsidize the adoption cost of solar energy systems in particular. So if over time you can move from a outright ownership, which we do across the board in Nigeria, you want to buy a house, you must buy it up front. You want to buy a car, no. For these solar systems, we're going to subsidize those adoption costs in order to move to like a lease to own model or energy as a service. I'm not going to take too much time because I know I jumped in front of Otome, but I think what you mentioned about advocacy is extremely important. This is not the first forum that Tengi and I have been on, and I feel like this is part of that advocacy, being able to come with our own quote unquote expertise and hear from the people. So I think this is also a welcome platform, which is why anytime AFPC is doing something, I'm looking to be part of that conversation. Otome, please, over to you.
Well, you stole my thunder. And by the way, I've ordered my smoky jollof rice on Uber Eats. But you know, I love the conversation, direction of the conversation. I think we've all acknowledged something here, that this is a journey, right? If you look at the industrialized nations, what we refer to as the developed countries, you realize that they started from somewhere. If you compare their journey with ours, I'll say that we're doing relatively well, right? The world recently became globalized, so now you can, you know, you can benchmark your progress with others, right? But remember that oil was discovered in 1860 in the United States, right? And if you read the history of how things progressed, they had different eras. There was, the oil boom, and then, there was the growth, and things were not handled as they should, or as they are handled currently. They had to go through the teething process, right? Where they developed policy, they went through the post-war era, and then, they started adopting technology, in the 80s, in the 90s, and now, in 2000 plus, you have, the whole talk about, transition, in adopting technology and sort of streamlining processes and all that process improvement. So we need to acknowledge that there was a journey, and we need to ask ourselves, where are we as a continent? Where are we as a country? Acknowledge what Chinaya said. Sometimes these things are, all over the place. But however, we have the PIA. Took 20 years, but it's here, right? It's been adopted, and it's been operationalized. And we're seeing some of the benefits. It's trickling in, right? But gradually, with folks like Sonkele, Tangi in the mix, we're seeing some cohesion, right? It's taking some time. But I just want us to acknowledge, my point to summarize is that it's a journey. Transition is a journey. We have to first calibrate first as a country, as a continent, get to that baseline. We're not even at the baseline of energy sufficiency. That being said, I'm not saying let's, drill and, pollute the environment. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that what is readily available, what is tested and trusted, what has been developed adequately is oil and gas. There's technology out there, and that's the advantage of globalization and collaborations, which we might speak to, that can help you develop this energy sources in a clean or decarbonized way, right? And so adopting those technologies will help us to sort of reduce our carbon footprint while we produce these products. And then we are able to raise funds. The truth about it is so many things have been talked about. Financing is key, investments are key. How do you raise investments, right? You need to have something to sell, right? You need to generate a product that people are buying. And so we have this resource, we can generate these funds. We have the African Energy Bank, right, that was recently launched, which is speaking to our independence as a continent to develop our projects without, solely depending on foreign direct investments. So we're getting there. Infrastructure is very key, has been also talked about. We don't have adequate infrastructure, but we are seeing it trickle in as well. If you look at clean cooking, you notice that there are some strategic depots that are, popping up across the country, right? Dover just launched their 20,000 metric ton LPG storage facility, massive. I'm affiliated to a company called Nesgas, building out a 50,000 metric ton in the east. These are things that are happening. The government, in terms of policy, have set up the MDGIF fund, for example, which is government saying we're going to invest in infrastructure. So, folks from all over the world come, bring your monies, we're putting our money where our mouth is. So I'm not saying that things are not in disarray, but I'm saying some patience is required. The awareness piece is critical, and we all have to do our part to educate people, to sort of shift from the current mindset and change the bias. That cultural change is hard, but we have that smoky jollof, sachet and other things that have been described. So we're getting there, but there has to be that transition. So I'll stop there. And great comments, great insights. I've been taking lots of notes here as well on the initiatives that are, ongoing today. And it's really interesting to see how we've evolved. I hope that we speak about the Nigerian carbon market because that's a game changer in terms of policy, in terms of sort of merging everything that is happening. Because with a carbon market in place, it sort of creates a global, in a sense, or a Nigerian framework that forces people to take certain steps, which is what we're seeing in different climes. We see in Canada, for example, in different jurisdictions, in Alberta, for example, you have the TER program, which puts thresholds in terms of emissions across different big emitters, right? So if you go above the threshold, you pay for that. If you're below the threshold, you get incentives, and that money is all used for technology and innovation. So the Nigerian carbon market will sort of activate or be a catalyst to sort of helping us to bring down our emissions across board. But I think it's a journey and we have to realize that. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Don't know where. Okay, I'm just gonna sort of. I wanted to address some of the comments as well that were made by Chineye. I started to do that in terms of what are we doing? Are we elitist or are we actually engaging, a good proportion of those who are impacted? And you'll see from my example, they've got like, I have soda by the way, some Kelly. I just wanted to say as well, yeah, no, that is still making noise in my ear. Sorry, excuse me. Right. So speaking to my points with Chineye's, what Chineye had said, before I come to that, actually, I wanted to make a comment to what Tommy just said, which was around the infrastructure for LPG. That's a very good point. I just also want to make sure that I make the point that Nigeria has been looking at both power and non-power uses. So non-power uses being LPG, but then there's also power, and there's a lot of things that we did not do over the years in terms of creating a stronger network for domestic uses, but also network for exports. And we have to be realistic about the market as well. Where is the market? Is the market available? How big is the market that we're trying to service? And what do we have to service that market? And we're looking at infrastructure. How much money funds realistically do we have to spend on, say, gas infrastructure versus looking at renewables? So again, there's always that trade-off, but it's also always important for Nigeria to make that balance and make those right decisions in terms of right sizing what its gas ambitions are and how that should feed into its decisions for renewables. So while we're looking at that, we have to look at what's realistic always. We're looking at that point. And then secondly, something that we haven't really talked about is around the impacts of this energy transition on other things beyond our environment. So I think at the top of the conversation, Otome had mentioned the flooding and other things that we're experiencing, to know that obviously climate change is real, but there are also the impacts on our economy based on decisions that other markets are making. So for instance, let me use the EU as an example. That's a huge market for Nigeria's petroleum products, but that they have a regulation coming in place that is going to limit imports from high emitting countries. So if, again, speaks to the point of the need to decarbonize and to adopt methane emission reduction strategies, because at some point we will have the resource. If we have not created a market to use it and we have targeted the market abroad, that market will not accept your product. On the one hand, on the second hand, you may not have infrastructure to get it there. And then when you design infrastructure to get it there, they may no longer need it because they also have plans to achieve net zero, to transition beyond fossil fuels as well. So it's also being aware of not just we want to do gas or etc. Is what's the market, how does it feed into that, and making realistic decisions, as we're making those plans. So that's sort of where our stance is. Now to looking beyond elites, I put in the comment, I don't know if you were seeing, there's a lot of questions in there as well. So let me make the point here is that we also engage with communities that are impacted, all producing communities, for instance. Speaking to the financial component, right? There are a lot of communities that depend on the revenues that come from the federal. which to some extent come from oil, right? That then trickles down. You mentioned Bayelsa State as being the poorest state, which is where I'm from. But I think it's more a case of we rely heavily on fossil fuel revenues, so government revenues, to the point of 80 to 90%, right? So the question is, when those revenues stop coming, what do states like mine do? So we're trying to navigate that with different states within the oil-producing states to say, how do you also build fiscal resilience, right, that ensures that we're not left stranded if revenues from fossil fuels diminish. You had the case with Enugu where there was reliance on coal. When that shift happened, what was the impact on their own sort of economy environment and such? So we engage with not only at the federal, we also engage at the local levels as well, at the state levels, and then we engage with communities to empower them to be able to ask the right questions, right? So my state, this is what's happening, or I've been told, what's going on? What's your role? How are you planning for this? We're already suffering so are we going to suffer more? So those sorts of conversations. Then we talk to the sub-states as well. This is what is happening, right, at the national level. How are you keying into this? And then also talking to the government themselves. How are you bringing this down, right, to states? How is this being integrated into development plans at ministry level, but also at state level as well? What are the local governments doing? We saw yesterday, was it a couple of days ago? Yesterday, probably, that local governments now have autonomy. So bring them also into the conversation. So you two now, this is what's going on, or how are you planning, to address this? It's very important. Unfortunately, it didn't come when it was early on in the years when everybody was sharing all money, so to speak. Not that we're advocating for that, but they had derivation and access to those sort of funds. So it's a reality where not just at the subnational level, also at the obviously government level as well, at the federal government level, there is that risk of the revenues. If your market is shrinking, if EU is changing their mind on what they're trying to do, etc., and the impact that will have, you have to be realistic in terms of what revenue is going to be lost and how to diversify not just your energy base, but also your revenue base. So these are realistic conversations that we want the government to make, not just at the federal, but also at the states and also at the local level, and also making sure that we empower communities to be able to ask the right questions and then trickles up, as Somkele said, sort of like a bottom-up approach, and then also making sure that we empower civil society. We work with partners as well to make sure they also empower them to also be able to train others to know what's going on and having the right information and the right data. We've published different reports on this. We have a methane emissions multi-stakeholder dialogue happening in a couple of weeks on 23rd of July. And we're bringing communities, we're bringing women, we're bringing youth, because we want their voices to be heard. But this is also after providing them with awareness and capacity to ask the right questions. So NRGI recognizes the need for all of these things. We're only one organization, we empower other organizations as well, but this requires a collective effort from all our parts. I like to say not just as an institution, but also within your sphere of influence. Your Instagram page, put something in there, you had this conversation. I heard about smoky jollof rice. The other alternative, not just this, we can also use, this and that as well. So you don't necessarily have to stick to gas, etc. Speak in language that resonates with you. Use videos and other things on TikTok and Snapchat and just share your thoughts on these things. The more people know, the more we can also get, mindset shift that we need to actually ensure that we're all moving together as citizens, as individuals, as communities, as local government, states, etc. Yeah, so I wanted to just make that point, that there are a lot of different risks involved, and there's a greater awareness that we need to have, and we can employ different tools and channels to make sure the message resonates and also advocate for change. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if Naomi, if it's okay for me to just jump in now, because we just spoke about policy. I wanted to make something clear. Tanguy hit on an important point about the Supreme Court ruling on local government autonomy and having to bring them in now as stakeholders, because they shouldn't be stooges for the governor anymore. I also wanted to touch on an important constitutional amendment, which is the Electricity Act 2023, which essentially enables states to generate, distribute, transmit power. What that has meant for us at the Energy Transition Office is that it's an opportunity to advocate directly to state governments to improve their energy mix. And we're working with a number of states at the moment top of which is Enugu State, which has already gone far and done an electricity law that mandates a certain percentage of generating energy to come from renewables. It's still a very costly effort to have utility scale solar, for instance. But again, like I said, with more investment going into research and development and innovation and having an enabling environment for that, we will see that those costs will begin to drop. I wanted to speak about financing very quickly. So the thing about financing that I have seen from where I sit is, it's not that there's no money, is that there is a dearth of quality projects that the financing can go into. So there are certain projects that they come up, it sounds good, but that project is improperly prepared. So you're there because you want an investor to invest in it. You're talking about 80% return on investment, and the investor is looking at you and saying, I only even want 30%. Why are you getting 70% for in this current climate? So we're supporting project preparation for various sponsors. In fact, all through this morning, that is what I've done. So the advocacy on all sides is necessary, and I'm happy with the work that the NRGI is doing in terms of bringing in host communities, because when you look at the just element of a transition, that justice is procedural justice, is redistributive justice. There are different meanings of what justice is. As Tengi has said, the Niger Delta people have been at the wrong end of the impact of investment in hydrocarbons. And then on top of that, you now want to say, okay, actually leave this thing that has impoverished you and go into this new thing. We need to make sure that that new renewable energy frontier that they're going into is carrying them along this time. Otherwise, it's almost like double wahala for dead body. So I think that it's so important that we're having these conversations. I think definitely we need a lot more input from Nigerians on the big plans that we come up with, especially as we're leading into NDCs. Should we be more focused on adaptation? Should we be more focused on mitigation methods? Those are conversations that we need to have. So I just felt like it was important for me to just put that as well. So back to you, Naomi.
All right, thank you so much. And the conversation has been so engaging and so insightful. And I just want us to speak a bit more on, investments, because I don't think that is the problem is that people don't want to invest. I just think that has Nigeria created, or Africa, have we created an enabling environment for that, particularly in the energy sector? So, Otome, I just want you to talk a bit on that. What are the challenges? What are the barriers, that may deter investment in Africa's energy sector? And what's the way forward on that?
That's an interesting question. And I think we've had very, good conversation, and we've touched on a lot of that. I think one major issue which has been highlighted, and Chineye spoke to this as well, is stability in policy. So you look around the world, for example, nature-based solutions. I'm working on some, in South America, and it's interesting to see how policy can sort of influence the narrative, right? Investor attractiveness. When you have stable policy, for example, this piece of land, I want to plant these trees, I'm going to have access to it for 20 years. Nothing is going to happen. Nothing has happened historically. You have that confidence to put in your money and invest, right? And like Kile mentioned at some point, that's a low-hanging fruit. It's naturally occurring sequestration system, right? So I think policy is good, creating a stable investment environment, having the right incentives, tax breaks, subsidies, and all of that. That would help the locals, first of all, and then, of course, bring in international funding. One key thing we've highlighted here, which I don't want us to miss, want to reiterate, is awareness, right? This funding is available. A lot of people don't know about it. Those who know about it do not know how to get it. Smart people, smart Nigerians are one of the smartest people around the world, right? And if you empower a Nigerian or an African, they do wonders. They always excel. And so that is where I think there needs to be more focus, giving a clear picture of what is available, giving guidance of how people can access it, and also we have pockets of people doing different things, bringing them together, merging people. I see that happening a lot where, Mr. A, Mr. B, Mr. C, they're doing things in silos. But if you just bring them together, you can create magic, right? So creating those platforms to sort of bring people together so that they are not reinventing the wheel, basically piecing together all their wins to make a bigger win. I think that's very important. So that's leveraging on local partnerships and then, of course, international partnerships, like Chineye mentioned at the Global Energy Show, for example. There were lots of people to talk to doing, innovative things, big and small, open to having discussions with different folks from all over the world. Those opportunities are there to copy and paste, right, through this sort of international partnership. So, and then there's something else that just popped into my head. We have a lot of projects that have been successful, small projects, tiny relatively, but successful across Nigeria, across Africa. We need to showcase those projects, right? They're community-based projects, and to speak to Zonkele's point, I think he's smarter than I am listening to him. I'm sure he can cite several projects that are currently running. There are communities in Africa that are running on solar, right? In some instances, IPPs, gas to power, and all that currently in play. So we need to celebrate those achievements and let people know this is working. We can scale, right? Also within Africa, beyond just cooperation, I mentioned collaboration within the country, international collaboration. There's also regional collaboration. So I know of the East African Power Pool, and sort of creating larger markets, regional markets to help, folks merge, provide some backfiller situation where you maybe have a power deficiency here, you can leverage on another country. That's what happens all over the world. In Canada, I've seen it happen where, for some reason there's some outages, unplanned events, and then there's no, in that instance where things should shut down, there's no shutdown, and even if there is, it's for a few hours because they leverage on regional support, pull power from other parts, other jurisdictions. We can do that, have that connectivity. So these are some, once we show that we're a business case, right? People will invest. Everybody I talk to in the US, in North America, in Europe, they are always interested in Africa, in Nigeria especially. But there's this notion of high risk. It's a high risk environment, right? But I keep telling them that people are doing business successfully, you know, but we should change the narrative and make it more, credible, more attractive to people. That whole notion of corruption has to change, right? And it's when we are able to showcase what is working, that people will start to see, okay, this might be a destination for, putting in funding and, creating new markets. So I think I'll stop there and maybe leave the floor for others to comment.
Okay, Something I would really like to hear your thoughts on this as well. So I don't know if you have some things to add to this.
Yeah, great. So I just wanted to just reel out some achievements because Otome had mentioned that there are some good projects that are out there. So the Nigeria Electrification Project was a World Bank AFDB funded initiative to improve access to energy in rural areas, so underserved and unserved areas. So just quickly, that NEP, there's a new iteration that's called DARES, Distributed Access to Renewable Energy Scale-Up, and that has its own objectives. But with the NEP, the achievement was that there were 152 completed and commissioned mini-grids that led to 57,776 total mini-grid connections. 1 million solar home systems were deployed, and the total amount of connections that was achieved by the Nigeria Electrification Project was 1.5 million connections. So that means there are 1.5 million people that have been impacted by this World Bank program. So there are things going on at scale that perhaps need to be broadcasted or made Nigerians made aware more of how they can participate and how people have already benefited. But I don't want to go into the territory that Otome was speaking about. I'll speak more around the financing. And the reason why financing is so important, because according to the Energy Transition Plan, which is about 2 years in operation now, we require $1.9 trillion to be able to get to where we need to get to by 2060. And that's on infrastructure, that's on workforce development, advocacy, whatnot, $1.9 trillion. Out of that $1.9 trillion, $410 billion is above business as usual. So if we carry on doing the things we do, there's an amount. But in order to step up a bit, we need $410 billion. Annually, that works out at roughly $10 billion per annum that we need in renewable energy investment to get to where we have already committed to in 2060. So we look at it and we say, where can we get that financing from? When we did an initial scoping of renewable energy opportunities in Nigeria, we saw that there was a $23 billion opportunity. That includes what Tengi has said about the gas flare commercialization program. That includes efforts to improve grid reliability and extension of grid potential. It cuts across metering, cuts across transmission. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the transmission side. But out of the more important thing that I wanted to highlight is that out of that $23 billion opportunity, $17 billion is coming from the private sector. What is it that the private sector actually needs? I think Otome already touched on this, and Tengi. They just need an enabling environment. They need to be able to know that there's not going to be a U-turn in a policy. So you have said to me now, you have pioneer status, you have a tax break in 10 years. If there should be a change in government at any point within that 10 years, I want to be sure that that's not going to affect my investment, because ultimately, if I invest $1 billion in a, let's call it a 2 gigawatt PV facility, and you make a certain policy decision, all that money goes down the drain. And that doesn't bode well for future investments, because ultimately investment is based on your risk appetite. And sometimes this risk is just that political risk. A lot of people emphasize the foreign exchange risk. But let me tell you something, there are investors that are in Gaza presently. There are investors that are in Ukraine, because when you look at the risk, you're able to apply some mitigation strategies that can make that risk worth it. And sometimes high risk leads to high returns. That's the rule of thumb, ceteris paribus. So in Nigeria, what we need to be doing, which I think Otome touched on, is aggregating the finances. The kind of ticket sizes that we need to make a huge difference cannot come from one single investor. we need to be able to leverage an industry like the pension funds, for instance, that have about 19 trillion naira in assets under management. And the risk return profile matches renewable energy investment, because for renewable energy investments, you need long-term patient capital that has moderate returns. So if you can convince a pension fund to key into an infrastructure fund or to key into a green bond, you will see that you're able to do a lot more, as opposed to relying on donor financing or grant financing, which just can't do it. And which is why I was speaking about the JETPs earlier, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. Senegal has benefited, it's not been disbursed, but it benefited about $2.7 billion. $8.5 billion was committed to South Africa's transition. And that $8.5 billion while it's a lot of money, they have costed that they require $98.8 billion within that time frame where they would get that $8.5 billion. So first of all, I think where the starting point for this is understanding what are we trying to achieve? What is the financial obligation for achieving those investments? What are the policies that are preventing financing from flowing or constraining some of the financing that is existing in the country? Because you'll be surprised the amount of financing when you look at investments. If you look at GDP, sorry, it's not, I have a teacher in me. The way we were taught about how to calculate GDP, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. X minus M is net exports. And the I there stands for investment, but a lot of people place too much focus on foreign direct investment. However, you can mobilize resources domestically. So the reason why aggregate financing is important is because it helps to de-risk that investment, depending on the capital stack you use. Sorry, please feel free to ask me if anything doesn't make sense. Depending on the type of funding, whether it's subordinated debt, whether it's preferred equity, you're able to de-risk investments for certain people whose risk appetite is not as large. So understanding a lot of that kind of conversation means that stakeholders must come together. Right now, in the distributed renewable energy landscape, there are donors that are working on similar things to other donors, but because they're working in silos, they can't see that there are economies of scale that will be more likely if they can come together. So the first point of call is, I know that the National Council on Climate Change is doing some work around having a view on all the RE investments in country, private sector or public sector, and harmonizing that in order to understand what our total investment needs are. So I say all this to say that we can benefit from a lot more conversation. My own take is perhaps from a high level and looking from the top down across the landscape, but there are certain people who have individual projects that can key into the bigger, wider renewable energy ecosystem. So I just want us to understand the size of the opportunity, but as well as the size of the challenge in terms of financing. $10 billion per annum is not easy. In renewable energy investments, it doesn't include all the other investments that need to be made in other important sectors to Nigeria. So coalescing local currency financing is extremely important for renewable energy. There are a few comments in the chat. They were coming up as I was talking, so I didn't want to be distracted by that. But I think that that's my contribution as regards your question.
All right.
Thanks, Somkele. I know we're fast spent for time, but I really want to make this input, and you've really said so much. Another challenge is we reel out some of these figures, but underneath it, there's so much that needs to be unpacked. So there was one thing about, so for instance, you talked about the NEP projects by the World Bank, and other projects. These are success stories, right? And, we're learning, we're iterating. However, some of the solar projects in Nigeria. So you have a lot of stranded assets, you have some assets, stranded power, you have assets that, so for instance, yes, it's good to connect people to for them to have light bulbs and little things here and there. But then there's a big case for like productive use of energy, because if it's productive use, obviously it's now more bankable. People, their collections, people can actually pay for the power. And if you find that sometimes because of this sort of lack of coordination, some people are citing these projects in areas that might not necessarily need all that power, and then the places that really need the power can't get the access. That's one challenge. Another challenge is, I know we do have incentives. At Firma Advisory, we help clients to get pioneer status, and but sometimes that process can be very drawn out and long, and and I even know personally a solar energy company that shut down because they had just imported some of their goods. Some of these books obviously are supposed to be duty-free, all that stuff. Customs wasn't having it. And then at the end of the day, they lost a lot of money that was tied down. And, so besides getting grants and subsidies, we need more bankable projects. You talked about patient capital long term, but we also need so when we talk about enabling the environment, sometimes because things on paper are not what, when it comes to implementation, people who are supposed to do it are not doing it. So that's why we talk about the weak institutions problem, where these guys have said all these amazing things. I remember when I read the gas master plan, and I was like, wow, beautiful. I've read lots of documents that told, made me feel like, wow, we really know what we're doing if we're really doing this. But then at the end of the day, there are a few of us on this call, but how are other people responding to this? And obviously, I know you cannot answer all that, but the good thing is that we know where we are as a country, we know our challenges, and there are opportunities like you all mentioned. So many, if not, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think that, as we're closing out now, it would be great to attempt answering some of the questions on the chat box, address you all. And as you're responding to the questions, be thinking through what your closing remarks are, what your call to action is, and where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? And how can we get our policymakers, the people who are meant to be the, implementing some of these things, how do we get them to, and I'm so happy, so like Tengi said, they've done lots of things. I can tell SC Paul has done amazing stuff, but that's because of the caliber of people in these institutions. They're not the majority, if I'm being very honest, but I think that, more advocacy with more sensitization, we can then have more clarity, more investments, and more jobs created, and just a better country and a better continent as a whole. So yeah, thanks. I just wanted to throw in those 2 points around the incentives and bankability of projects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Chineye. We would like to just go straight to questions. I don't know if someone wants to say something, but okay.
I was gonna say something, and be sorry for cutting you short. When sometimes when these discussions are going on, you have brain waves. And I think something that struck me when I was listening to Somkele is that we have a data problem, right? We have an issue with getting credible information, right, in the country. That is a gap we need to fill, right? We need to have a way where we can, for example, quickly identify where are the gaps in terms of infrastructure. We have power generating capacity in this part of the country. We can't wheel out the power, and the population is in another part that requires this power, right? How do we sort of put together a database that helps people see this very transparently? I think data acquisition is something that is very critical. Having those data platforms, first of all, would help us to really understand the problem and dimension the problem. So it's a gap, but it's also an opportunity. And just speaking to what Chineye said about what can we do, what are the solutions? That is a solution, right? Understanding baselining first is critical to resolving the problem. If we don't baseline, people would work in silos. People would identify a small problem and they'll be attacking it. And that might be having a negative impact somewhere else, right? But if you have an end-to-end understanding of the problem based on data, then you can now holistically resolve the problem, adopting the right policies that are bespoke, and then, sort of building from there. So just wanted to add that. Sorry, Naomi, for stopping you from speaking. Please go ahead.
All right, that's fine. So we just want to go to questions. There are so many questions here. And I think Otome would answer this first question because it's on carbon markets. So Peter is asking, how do individuals benefit from the carbon market for actions taken at individual level in upgrading cleaner energies?
Okay, sorry, was that for me? Okay, okay. Okay, I think I spoke about the carbon market, and Sukile can chip in as well as Tengi, because I mean you're sitting right there in the energy transition office. I think carbon markets are critical. I mentioned earlier on that you have these compliance markets and voluntary markets, that sort of drive or incentivize people to invest in greenhouse gas emission reduction projects, right? Because the whole idea is you invest in that project, you're able to, once you adopt the right methodology and protocols, you're able to access different markets and you're able to convert those, each ton of CO2 you reduce to credits that generates revenue, right? Because you have to go through all the process of testing the projects for additionality and what have you. There's a process. It is what we do at Modern West, help companies to run through the process and add that additional value. So beyond just, oh, this is a CSR project, you can actually leverage on markets. So bringing a market to Nigeria, honestly, it's thumbs up to the government. This is sort of part of what we're talking about when we say journey, right? That brings everything together. It speaks to our NDCs, of course, first of all, because for us to have, achieve that net zero by 2060, there have to be mechanisms, national mechanisms that push people in that direction. So in simple terms, the Nigerian carbon market is a cap and trade system, I think. And, there's a cap, right? If you do below the cap or the imposed threshold for emissions, you get incentives. You're able to generate funds. If you do above, then you have to pay the balance. So companies can take advantage of this once this is set up. Small companies, big companies, depending on how the framework is set up, to generate extra funds, and that those funds can be diverted into different things, research, innovation, and what have you. But there's more detail behind that, and I think if you are following what the NCCC is doing, you can go to their site, you will see more information around the carbon market activation. So I hope that provided some clarity.
I'm sure it did. I don't know if somebody has something to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that again, emphasizing what Thomas said about journey, is that the carbon market activation plan process is a journey to a compliance market. So what we're trying to establish in Nigeria and on continent is a voluntary carbon market at the moment, because the renewable energy space is not yet mature enough to have a compliance market. The difference between the two of them is that in a voluntary carbon market, you're talking about a B2B exchange or a G2G exchange around this is how much of emissions I've avoided. And for you, your company that can't avoid those emissions, you essentially pay me to be able to meet up with that cap that we have. And it's very different in a compliance market, because in a compliance market, the revenue per ton emitted, I think, is about $100 or $120. But on the continent in Africa, those carbon credits are trading for about $6 a ton. So developing that market even makes a better case for revenue generation. You have to think about it that the integrity of those projects, there needs to be some verification. I think right now in country, we only have about 3 verification companies around carbon markets, because you don't want to say you avoided this and then double count it in another project. So I just wanted to add that what we're essentially trying to do in country is a voluntary carbon market system, but we're eventually going to pivot or grow into a compliance market, which then it'll be a lot easier on an individual scale to be able to access carbon credits. But at the moment, there needs to be a bit of aggregation. So I'm totally in support of what Thomas said. I just wanted to add those extra points.
Thank you, Somkele. And another question, and I want you, Somkele, to address this. It says, do we have a sense of how the energy transition will financially impact the end user or affect the economic well-being? Is there data available for this kind of matrix?
That's a great question. There is data available that shows what a certain contribution of renewable energy will mean for GDP. There's data available for how much that will mean for jobs. There's certain amount of information that can show what certain investments will mean for emissions reductions. So that information is available. I think people can reach out to me for in-depth documents. So there are a lot of documents that are available that I feel will be very helpful to people that have participated in this call or their friends that hear about this. So there is information there that properly dimensions the contribution of renewable energy investments to Nigeria's economic growth, but I'll have to provide that document to you offline. I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. There's another question directed at you. I think people have a lot of concerns around financing and investments. And this person actually, spelled out your name. So really, really wants to hear your thoughts on this. So it says, Somkele, could you say something about the installed 14 solar IPPs and that got PPAs in 2016? And as you know, investors had serious concerns around FX and policy, environmental risks. Even the 2 of them got PCOAs, and even the 2 of them that got PCOAs could advance the financial close for the above reason. So I think the person just wants you to talk a bit about the installed 14 solar IPPs that got PPAs in 2016.
Okay, just for clarity, Leonard and I actually worked together on some ease of doing business engagements a few years back. But Leonard is a great point. The 14 solar IPPs were supposed to have an important impact in our renewable energy journey. I think there have been issues around agreements on tariffs, the cost of certain generating resources, and then end user tariffs. There's supposed to be some contributions that the government was supposed to make. There was talks about a solar hybrid fund where the IPPs were supposed to get some funding for. So I've actually personally engaged with 2 of the 14 IPPs, Afrinergia and City Cosmos. So even though there is an aggregate problem, some of them also have individual challenges, approvals that need to be signed and whatnot. So I think those projects are are stalled at the moment just because of there are certain areas where the project sponsors are not in agreement with federal government stakeholders. But Leonard, happy to speak to you offline in depth.
All right. Tengi, I think you're still here, and I just want to have you say something on this question. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
All right. The question says, if finances are aggregated, how well have we demonstrated capacity to properly handle consolidated funds? Is there a way transparency and initial capacity demonstrated before gallivanting consolidated funds? So I think the question is all about, I know you spoke about a bit about, transparency and all of that in the beginning of the session. So I think that this person just wants clarity on the proper way to handle funds in a transparent manner, that, funds that are allocated for renewable energy projects and renewable energy infrastructure and the couple likes.
Okay. I will try to answer it to the best of my ability. So from our perspective, again, transition finance is something that's very important and very key. I think during the conversation at some point, some Kele mentioned the $1.9 trillion that's been said or stated that will fund the energy transition. And for us, it's important to have sort of a very specific breakdown, and I believe that exists in terms of how that will feed into projects and activities. And we think it's important to also have civil society be part of that process to monitor the space to see how much we're actually receiving, how much is being implemented, where the gaps are, etc. We've seen similar issues of financing or mismanagement within the petroleum governance space. There are always different panels and national assemblies calling institutions like NEDC to order. We do not want to repeat of something similar. It's important, therefore, to make sure that civil society is part of the process. It is a transparent process as well for the public to understand how much monies are being contributed, what the gap is as well to serve that transition finance for the activity. So it's important for us to have that clarity, first of all, so transparency and disclosure of what the finances are, and then enable or bring in civil society to be able to monitor that process, or even for those handling the funds to be able to disclose where we are. I think it was stated by Otome, the more information we have, the more clarity we have, the more we understand what progress is being made, and then adopting processes similar to the standards by the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Those sort of principles also allows us to ensure that there's transparency in the space, and we're all sort of moving along in the same sort of trajectory. Okay, thank you.
So we'll just take one more question, and then we would, have closing remarks and all that. And I think this question is, Otome, I'd like you to answer this question. It's about funding as well. All the questions are about funding, honestly speaking, financing, investments, and all that. So I think the person just wants more information about funding opportunities, because I know that you had mentioned that the funding is there, it's just that there's lack of awareness on these funding opportunities. So I think she just wants a bit of some of the funding information about some of the funding opportunities that are available in the energy sector or the energy space.
Okay. So I would speak to one, and I would defer to my colleague Sunkile. So I think in terms of funding opportunities, speaking from someone in diaspora, I think there are quite a lot of sustainability linked, funds. And in fact, people in the North American jurisdiction, they have abundant access to different funding schemes. So you have a brilliant idea, an application that does something interesting in the climate change space, maybe calculating your carbon footprint, or you have a small project that shows a clear case of carbon emission reductions. there are funds that you can quickly access. So that's in the developed world. In Nigeria, I can tell you that there's also funding. There's a company called Olon, for example, as a shell-owned company. They've sponsored over 40 renewable energy companies. We might not know this, that might not be in the general public, but it's the case, and they're funding more companies, right? So it's about information, right? So I'll say Google Olon, right? There's an application process, I guess. You can, go in there and see what opportunities are there if you have, interest in developing like, a solar power company, and you want to go into renewables. I'll say you can check that. If you want to look at international funding, you can connect with me on LinkedIn and we can talk some more, because I see that we're already 10 minutes over time. But be rest assured that it's a Google click away. And maybe Sonkili and Tengi can speak to other funding opportunities, but check all on.
All right, so Sonkili, just briefly, in like 1 minute or two, to just add to that so we can go to closing remarks.
Okay, great. So Olon is a great one because the company I mentioned earlier on that is providing or plans to manufacture PV panels of up to 100 megawatts a year were funded by Olon. So again, the funding options are dependent on what is your project ticket size, what type of funding are you looking for? Are you looking for equity? Are you looking for debt? Because that really determines where I can point you in the direction to. If you're looking at, for instance, supplying renewable energy projects as a middleman in the value chain, you can access loans from commercial banks like Wema Bank, that is very interested in renewable energy, as well as Sterling Bank. If you're thinking more larger scale projects, the Bank of Industry is there on the development bank side. But then there's also the DARES program, which I spoke about earlier, that is supporting, it's a World Bank funded program, World Bank and AFDB, that is being implemented by REA. That's for standalone solar for productive use, mini grids, and solar home systems. But as Otome said as well, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll provide my email address, and then I can point you in the right direction based on that. So that's my 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. It's been such an engaging conversation, and I'm just want to say that it really just ties down to the work that we do here at the Firma Advisory. We're very keen on contributing our own quota to the energy sector, and supporting our clients by offering excellent legal and regulatory advice in terms of regulatory compliance within the energy sector and the likes. We work with companies such as Millennium Oil and Gas. I know that that's a popular big company here in the oil and in the energy sector, and we're very keen on engaging in conversations like this to talk about some of the concerns within Nigeria's energy sector and Africa's energy sector as a whole. So in just 1 minute, we could just give closing the opportunity to our speakers to give closing remarks, and just a call to action, next steps, what you think we can take home from this webinar. We've taken a lot. This is like an energy course actually, because I've learned so much, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity myself. You don't get to be in these kind of rooms with these kind of experts every day. So it's very important that, these kind of platforms exist. So just a quick call to action and closing remarks. We'll start with Tengi.
Okay, thank you. Then I was prepared to be the first person. Okay, call to action. First, I'll say that yes, I recognize that there's a lot being said during this conversation, A lot of technical jargon probably being thrown around. And a lot of things that you've heard today, you will likely not remember after this. However, NRGI has a helpful tool that you can use. We have a guidebook on energy transition that we developed, which provides information, data, some on what we've been doing in the space, what we've learned as well, that you can sort of use as a helpful guide in terms of what we think the Nigerian government can do in terms of preparing for implementing the energy transition. So that could be like a first point for you. Secondly, we think it's very important for everyone on this call to really reflect and figure out, either through your institutions, where you work, how you will contribute to advancing for a just energy transition. Where I've spoken about, what we do with communities, etc., youth, women, and all marginalized groups. It's important to have that in mind and that focus. We have a couple of engagements again planned around these issues. We have one on July 23rd as well. It'll be a hybrid session looking at the implications of Nigeria's gas expansion plans and what the implications are in terms of the environment, in terms of it right-sizing its plans and thinking through it and implementing it in a way that feeds into the energy transition sort of plans that Nigeria has. So you can join that. We also have a Twitter space. We're collaborating with Budget on it on Monday at 5 o'clock, I believe. So you can also join that and learn more. And again, we've been advocating again as something that I think Otome said earlier on about more information and more data on what the government plans are in terms of the infrastructure needs and also the financing for gas specifically. Now that we've gotten the Decade of Gas published and disclosed, it's also important to have more information around the action plans and timelines and milestones, etc., as well, so that we can all follow along and hold the government accountable. So you can also join those, and then you can look at NRGI's website that has those information. You can follow me on LinkedIn. If you have more information, my name appears as it is here. You can follow me as well on Twitter, etc. We'll share their information, but essentially what we're trying to push for is for just energy transition. Educate yourself as much as you can so that you can educate those in your sphere of influence as well, and try to make a deliberate effort to be part of the conversation so that we can all move forward cohesively, collaboratively, in a way that achieves the goals that we have all set and we believe will help Nigeria achieve its sustainable development and energy transition goals. Thank you.
All right, Somkele, over to you. Closing remarks.
Thank you. I think I'll first of all plug the website for the energy transition plan, which is energytransition.gov.ng. I think there's a whole lot of information on there. I've already given my name appears as it is on this call on my LinkedIn, so feel free to connect. I wanted to just personalize the closing remarks in that I've been called a subject matter expert over and over in this call, but I've been working in this field for about 2 years. I'm an economist, and obviously I understand the wider power value chain and whatnot, but in terms of renewable energy, I've been working dedicated to this space for 2 years. So it's an encouragement to everybody that if you do feel like this is an area where you can add value, whether it's from the project side, from the advocacy side, from whatever side you want to add, you can definitely do a lot of internal research. You can also reach out to people who are working in the spaces and participate in this kind of fora, because I also gain a lot. I've gained a lot from Tengi, from Chineye, from yourself, Naomi, from Otome, by only just being in this space. But the one thing that I want us to leave with is that climate change is actually real. It's here to stay. So we just need to make sure that we're prepared and we're taking adaptive and mitigative measures to adjust. Thank you.
All right, and Otome, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first of all, to Firma Advisory for setting this up. I think this is you doing your own part to create awareness, so well done. And I'm looking forward to more webinars like this. I think you put me last because I didn't come up with a jollof rice recipe, but it's okay. Um, so I think for me, we spoke about awareness. There is the private sector ESG forum, which is coming up later in the year in November. And this is more or less bringing people together from different industries to speak across, the continent. Sustainability experts talk about, strategies to decarbonize, basically creating an avenue for people to share ideas. So I would encourage people to follow that space. If Google private sector ESG forum, you see what happened in 2023. You can also go to our website, Modern West Advisory. There are lots of free videos you can watch that would, help you understand certain concepts in terms of carbon markets, in terms of sustainability, ESG, and all of that good stuff. I think, generally speaking, it starts with the individual, changing our mindsets, right? So I would encourage everybody on the call to Google free carbon accounting tools, right? Try and measure how much you emit as an individual, right? And you'll be shocked that you could change your strategies and do your bit. For example, you can start carpooling. Instead of driving your car, you can join someone else. You reduced your carbon footprint that way. You can turn off your lights, when you're not in certain spaces. I know some people here, turn on all their ACs, leave them on to, but you can actually do your own bit and reduce your carbon footprint. Um, and I know we talked about the big wins, which would be a situation where we have like a database. Um, but it starts from small things like metering and bringing those technologies that can help us measure and account for our emission footprint. So I know there's a lot of work being done in that space, and that's another industry on its own. But I'll just say well done to Firma, and happy that I was invited, and looking forward to connecting with as many people as possible offline. LinkedIn is a good forum, so please feel free to reach out, and happy to continue the conversation. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Ms. Chine, just going to give some closing remarks and then we'll go. I think you're muted. You're muted.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry about that. I was just gonna say you look beautiful, Naomi. Thank you so much for an awesome moderation. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. I know that this webinar, we kind of put it together. I wouldn't say it wasn't short notice, but we kind of had to move things around because of scheduling and all that. But I think it worked out perfectly. Everyone who was meant to be on this call was on the call. A lot of rich insights were shared. I know people have been joining, leaving, depending on people's schedules, but thankfully we've had a very elaborate conversation, which we hope that would lead to action in various ways. Thankfully, the people on the call are already taking action, the speakers on the call. For those of you that joined, depending on what sector you're coming from, maybe those who are from the private sector, maybe if you're an entrepreneur, someone like me, for instance, like Sumkule said, I'm a bit of a generalist, and sometimes I don't like to reveal all my hats, because if I reveal all my hats, people will get confused. They'll be like, how are you doing this? It has its challenges, because I mean, like for instance, I said I'm just recovering from being unwell, because when you're juggling so many things. But for me, I'm an entrepreneur, lawyer, entrepreneur, impact investor. And when you talk about being an impact investor or a social entrepreneur, one of the very important sectors to me, I'm only concerned about two major sectors, or three major sectors. One is technology, energy, and obviously the work we do that cuts across. However, when you break it down now, technology and energy, there are different ways to look at it. There's a policy side of things, there's the investment side of things, there's the legal side of things. So that's why for me, and then there's even technology in energy. So a lot of times you find that a lot of things are like interwoven, right? So that's why I'm very interested in this. And another thing is because energy is a catalyst for other sectors. So we need to get energy right in Nigeria, in Africa. And I hope and I pray that everybody who needs to do their part does their part. For government, I can't keep emphasizing there's so much work that needs to be done. The Nigerian government has to do so much. When I keep referencing Canada, but the other countries, having a clear framework, strengthening institutions, strengthening the capacity in those institutions, letting people have access to finance, access to incentives. That's the only way we can move the needle. Then the clarity, access to justice, if something goes wrong, people have recourse, and then gradually we'll be able to get to where we need to be as a nation. So thank you. It's been an awesome time. Thank you to my speakers once again. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
All right, thank you, everyone. This session will be available on Firma's YouTube so that you can always rewatch and relearn and all of that. So thank you so much, our speakers. We're so grateful.
Thank you.
For the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Right. Bye for now.
Bye.